Hello, Professor Repnikova. It's so great to have you here today in this episode of Today on Wall Street. So, Professor Repnikova, you are currently an assistant professor in global communication at Georgia State. This year, you're also a Wilson Fellow at the Wilson Center for Scholars. But you're also an author of a great book, Media Politics in China: Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism. So, before we get started, can you first introduce to us a little bit how you got started in studying the machineries of Chinese media? Why is this such an interesting topic to you?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to share some of my work on your show. So I got started with this topic many years ago as a master's student at Oxford, where I was on the Rhodes Fellowship studying comparative government and working with Professor Vivian Xu in particular, who's a renowned expert in Chinese politics and local governance. And she really encouraged me to think about journalists and media as this really fascinating space of contestation, but also cooptation when it comes to party-society relations. So I started out by looking at journalism education, in particular how journalism is taught, including its political aspects, are taught in Chinese universities, and then how students process and relate to this information. And through that, I ended up meeting a lot of really fascinating journalists who came as guest speakers and guest lecturers, and they were really interesting to talk to, and I learned a lot from those conversations initially, and then pursued my PhD in politics, focusing on China and specifically looking at journalists' state relations.
I see. So interesting. And, I read your book, Media Politics, with great relish. In the book, I noticed that you have this argument that consent building in China is not all about repression and censorship, as the outside world tend to believe. But, in fact, many Chinese citizens, even including business elites who have access to global media, they willingly support the party for its successes and they celebrate those successes. So can you elaborate on that point a little bit? Specifically, what are the tools that the party uses to achieve cooperation and consent, as you argue in the book?
Sure. So I want to start with the example that comes from the book, which is that related to journalists, in particular, where we hear so much about censorship, right, surveillance, other aspects or channels also work and kind of co-opting journalists to comply with restrictions, but also to promote a more pro-regime or I guess a relatively non-critical or not too critical of a point of view in their writings. So in my study, I found that the government, the party state at the central level, but also some of it at the local level as well, would sort of co-opt journalists by inviting them to participate in governance and essentially inviting them to write on certain issues critically, but only in a constructive way. This idea of constructive criticism, I think it's a very Chinese kind of characteristic of journalistic practice that is currently also being sort of taught and explained to audiences in the developing world. So it's outside of China, it's kind of this feature that's empowering. And the notion is that journalistic reports should be hopeful and they should have solutions. But those solutions are either something that journalists have to find themselves or they have to echo policies and ideas and interviews of officials. So as a result, the reporting ends up being, I guess, much more mild in its critique and more hopeful than otherwise it would be if this was a Western media covering a crisis in China, where solutions are not part of this sort of agreement, arrangement, or practice. And journalists, many of whom I interviewed over the years, would also see themselves as contributing to some aspects of governance in China, in particular at the local level, when it comes to shifting policies or getting the government to respond. They had some hopes about some of these changes being made through their reporting, especially when social media ends up propelling and pushing forward this issue at the national, the national scale. So there's this kind of notion of inviting, into governance. And I think this is happening also with big tech companies now in China, like Tencent, for instance, where they're invited to participate in innovation projects under China 2025 and lead some of these projects, which of course also come with resources. But these tech companies in turn end up becoming loyal gatekeepers, right, to the party. So this notion of kind of inviting into really promising governance projects, I think trickles down to other players, not just media. But there are other ways as well. For instance, when it comes to social media or public opinion at large, we see oftentimes propaganda reports or just, official media reports echoing public voices. They don't just kind of tell people what to think, but they also echo the sentiments of society. So during the pandemic, we saw that happening at large, where a lot of these reports were about national unity and celebrating heroes and kind of telling their stories rather than telling the stories of officials. I think that also is a way to kind of co-opt or create consent or agreement or unity, because it suggests that the party is with the people rather than kind of preaching at the people or controlling them. So there are many different types of, I think, channels here at play, but also it's important to note that it's easier to do all of that when the party is relatively successful with producing economic growth, and with China becoming such a powerful country globally. And I know we'll talk about that later, about nationalism. It's just easier to kind of create those sort of sentiments when it's more successful. But if success is less apparent, or if there are new crises, that becomes also more challenging.
I see, I see. It's pretty clear from your description that there are permissible, acceptable issues to talk about. There are criticism as long as they're constructive or, ends up being hopeful. But there are also topics that are considered off the limit. And in fact, many commentators argue that, the range of off the limit issues during the Xi Jinping era has tremendously expanded. Originally, China's space for freedom of expression was limited, but that space seems to have shrunk dramatically during the era of Xi Jinping. So is that true? Based on your observation, what are some of the most notable changes that have taken place in media sphere during the past decade or during Xi Jinping's reign?
Yeah, there's certainly several levels of restrictions or changes that have taken place, starting with regulation of the internet. We have new policies such as real name registration, kind of criminalization of rumors, centralization of internet governance under the Cyberspace Administration of China. But we also see more pervasive censorship and preemptive and post-factum censorship. I think part of it is because media outlets are now all online, right? Most people consume information online, so it's easier to adjust content, to delete it, to ask for, editors to change it. But also part of it is just that, as you said, some of the topics that used to be more permissible are no longer as easily accessible. It's hard to kind of pinpoint exactly which of those topics are less permissible. I think what's happening is that censorship is much quicker. So some of these topics like corruption, like environmental degradation, like sexual harassment, they're still semi-permissible. I consider them to fall under kind of the gray zone versus the red zone. But the government and the censoring kind of regulators are much quicker to establish those boundaries. So once an issue becomes very popular on Weibo, or on WeChat, and people are especially protesting physically, it's often very quick that this kind of clampdown happens and becomes no longer permissible. So I think the speed is kind of one of the big differentiating issues, and the pervasiveness of censorship.
I see. And next I wanted to turn to China's relationship with the world. If you look at Chinese media, especially Chinese state media these days, we see lots of propaganda seems to be centering on this idea of Dongsheng Xijiang, the East is rising and the West is declining. And that seems to be especially the case after the Alaska summit that took place a few weeks ago, and after the exchange of sanctions among countries on Xinjiang. So, in general, how would you describe the Communist Party's success in fueling that kind of nationalistic sentiments and animosity towards the West? And in general, do you think people like us in the West should be worried, and shall we have a counter narrative there towards China?
Yeah, that's a great question about sparking nationalism. I think, first of all, it's not new. The nationalism kind of sentiment has been already on the rise in China over more than maybe 2 decades. And scholars have written about that in other spheres, but especially online. So it's not something that's kind of just appeared, under Xi. So in some ways, he's tapping into it, or the government is tapping into it by fueling this kind of sentiment that China is better, or it's rising, and the West is indeed kind of weaker. I think the pandemic, of course, was a helpful factor in that, many countries didn't manage it well. The US in particular, early on, or for the first year of it, was really not doing well at all. So I saw a lot of reports that were comparing China and the US, and China coming out much stronger, more efficient, more proactive. So that made the US obviously look weak. And I think that works for sparking kind of sentiment of pride in what China is doing. So is it effective? I think domestically it can be quite effective. And we see that, if anything, it's on the rise, this kind of sensation of, supporting, defending China at all costs. So that seems to be working. But what can the West do about this? Well, it's hard to do something about China's nationalistic sentiment, because obviously it's so many people, and it's really impossible to just change or transform sentiments at large. I think, first of all, if the West, or I guess the US in particular itself, ends up changing its domestic governance for the better, or addressing some of its systemic problems, it's going to be harder to create that kind of narrative. So I think a lot of it, in my view, is coming from domestic sort of origins. And I think it's also still helpful and useful to expand some exchanges with Chinese youth, whether it's education exchanges, cultural exchanges. I think we should still try to engage more, at least on those kind of less sensitive areas. And I hope that under this administration, there'll be more of that.
I see. Interesting. And, in your book, you also compare sort of various degrees of authoritarianism regimes and their media operation. So, I guess, how would you compare the degree of media freedom across authoritarian regimes like China versus hybrid authoritarian regimes like Russia? And in general, do you think the degree of media freedom go hand in hand with the country's degree of democratic progress?
Yeah, I think overall the degree of media freedom does go hand in hand with kind of democratization, democratic progress. But I think freedom is not the only kind of measure or not the only feature when we think about media governance. So one of the comparisons I was making with Russia was that in China, even though the media space itself is definitely less open and the issues that media are allowed to talk about are narrower. For example, in Russia, one could critique potentially President Putin or write very critical things about the whole system, whereas in China, that's not possible. But at the same time, in China, at least up until recently, there's been this kind of sentiment that the government somewhat listens to the media, especially the reputable kind of national level outlets that produce high quality reporting. They still have some effect in disciplining at least lower level officials. Whereas in Russia, the most critical voices, who happen to be more critical than in China, tend to find themselves isolated and kind of on the very edge of that system where they're not really being listened to. There's kind of this wall between them and the government, and the sense that they're kind of preaching to the choir of kind of like-minded intellectuals, dissidents, and protesters. So I think in that kind of way, we see somewhat more engagement and more perhaps effect in the case of Chinese media, even though it's more controlled. So what I was hoping to get at is kind of the quality of engagement and responsiveness, not only the degree of freedom. And of course, in any context, even say US, for instance, there is obviously media freedom, but there's also commercial pressure on the media to perform. And that means some degree of control or selectivity when it comes to what issues are being covered and in what way. So freedom is never kind of, I think, a very clear or a fully kind of articulated ideal. It's something that people often talk about, but when it comes to freedom, one could say it's not really realized anywhere to the fullest extent, because we do have other players that influence media coverage, whether it's companies, advertisers, or the public itself.
Gotcha. So interesting. And, speaking of, China's sort of media push, there's also an external media push, which is this huge global media project to project a more positive image to the outside world about China. And, through many channels, diplomats, external propaganda outlets, etc. How would you assess the empirical success of China's global media push?
Yeah, the global media push has been a subject of quite a bit of debate and obviously some controversy as well, with Chinese state media now named foreign agents in the US and the revoking of license of CGTN in Britain. So we see some of this kind of pushback. Empirically, we still know quite little about how effective Chinese media outwards engagements are. From what we do know, there's quite a few studies actually from the developing world versus US or Europe. We see studies coming out of Africa and Latin America that still suggest that the effect is quite minor when it comes to engagement and reshaping public perceptions about China. In particular, many journalists in countries like South Africa and Kenya, they don't end up really trusting Chinese media as a credible source because of its associations with the government. They prefer Western sources, but also there is often this kind of brand factor that's not a well-known brand yet. So in Latin America, there's more recognition of actually RT, Russia Today, than of Chinese outlets. So there's several kind of challenges there, but I think Chinese media is also quickly evolving. It's first of all, it's localizing, so hiring lots of local professionals on the ground. It's also, as you know, inserting various kind of publications into local papers, for instance. So there's kind of a sense of localization by, collaborating with other local outlets, but also working with diaspora and kind of getting diaspora to cover more of kind of Chinese official narratives or rhetoric through its own outlets. So I think there's quite a few new sort of, not so new, but, sharpening techniques that perhaps will shift that as well. But also Chinese media to kind of infrastructure, for example, providing digital TV access in Africa or 5G access, like the infrastructure of communication is something where China is very powerful. And especially in the developing world, it's almost impossible to compete with. So I think the infrastructure part might be a more successful domain than just content itself.
I see. So interesting. So final question of the day. In addition to media politics, so what are some of the other projects that you're currently working on? Can you please, let us know a little bit so we have something to look forward to?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm working on 2 manuscripts at the moment, 2 books. One of them is a short, accessible book. I hope it will be read outside of academic circles as well. It's on Chinese global soft power. So it's engaging with the kind of question just asked about global media, but also looking at Confucius Institutes, education exchanges and trainings, as well as public diplomacy spectacles like economic summits, the Olympic Games, and so forth. So that should be out, I hope, sometime late fall. And the other larger book that I'm working on is China's soft power engagement in Africa, specifically looking at Ethiopia, where I've spent quite a bit of time over the past few years.
Gotcha. We are excited to learn more about those books once they come out. So what I will do is I will put a link to your website so interested readers can read more about your work. But thank you so much, Professor Repnikova. This has been such a great conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.